He loves golf. He hit the opening tee shot at Bobby Jones Golf Course a few weeks ago. His Bobby Jones Golf Course actually opened in 1932, and Bobby Jones was there to hit the ceremonial tee shot at 1 p.m. on, I believe, a December or November day that year. And lo and behold, here was his grandson with all this standing out there a few weeks ago after the rebirth of Bobby Jones, hitting the ceremonial tee shot as well again. So, and by the way, he hit it right down the middle. It was the best tee shot he probably ever hit in his life. He loves golf. He's a member at the Atlanta Athletic Club, which is a club, by the way, his father founded, which is a long story he may tell us about it. The Atlanta Athletic Club was at the East Lake Club downtown before it moved out in the suburbs in the 60s. He's a member at Sage Valley and at Highlands Country Club in North Carolina, so he has no shortage of good golf courses to play. Well, he's got a fourth one now downtown called Bobby Jones. So he lives in Cumming with his wife, Mimi, who's delightful. I've met her. It's actually much more interesting than Bob, but we won't talk about that today. But let me introduce you to Dr. Bob Jones IV to tell us about Bobby Jones.
Okay. I love applause when I start to speak because, it's very rare that I have applause afterwards. So if any of you want to keep applauding, now would be the time. There we go. I'm going to do you all a favor, and rather than stand in this podium where the glare off the top of my head is going to make visibility difficult, I'm going to sort of stay on the move a little bit, preferably over in this range. I want to, first of all, take a moment to welcome you all to the Bobby Jones family. This is a major, major step for us as a family. We have been wanting to expand our grandfather's name and image commercially for a long time, but we always have to find the right partners, people who really get what Bobby Jones is all about. And we are so honored that Mosaic is now Bobby Jones Links. If I could have 50 people behind me, we would all applaud you. And we are so grateful to have you in the Bobby Jones family. I want to talk to you a little bit about my grandfather, because he was perhaps the single most, next to my father, the single most important person in my life. There is no aspect of my life that his shadow has not fallen over. And for many, many years, I was actually quite intimidated to follow in his footsteps. But now I come to see that carrying on the Bob Jones name and the Bob Jones legacy is one of the greatest honors that I could possibly have. And I hope I'll be able to share some of that enthusiasm and some of that excitement with you in what I'm going to speak to you about today. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about his life. Now, you've got some stuff that Whitney has written there about the Bobby Jones Dash. You've seen a little video this morning. And so I may be covering some things that you already know, but I think it's important for you to hear it from me. My grandfather was born on St. Patrick's Day of 1902, March the 17th of 1902. He was a very, very sickly child, and what made it even worse was what had happened 1 year ago to the day before he was born. On March the 17th of 1901, my grandmother, Clara, delivered her first child, a little boy whose name was Bailey. He was born on March the 17th of 1901. Bailey, too, was a very, very sick child. And he did not thrive at all. He couldn't eat, and when he did eat, he would throw it up. And medicine was just nowhere near what we would know today. And in August of 1901, when she was already pregnant with my grandfather, Bailey died from a condition that would be called failure to thrive today. To say that this was absolutely devastating to my grandmother, my great-grandmother, would be a massive understatement. For the rest of her life, she would never speak of Bailey by name. She would simply refer to him, if she referred to him at all, as the baby that died. My great-grandfather, Robert Permetus Jones, would never refer to him at all. It was considered by them to be almost a failure. Shortly after Bailey's birth and after Bailey's death, while my great-grandmother was pregnant with Bub, that's what we called my grandfather, she realized that one of the biggest problems was there was no really good medicine available in Canton, Georgia at the time. And she absolutely insisted that my great-grandfather move to Atlanta, where there was better medical care. And to a large extent, my grandfather survived that early illness by simply the force of will of his mother. She watched over him and protected him. He too did not eat solid food until he was 5 years old. And while he did enjoy a lot of the things that kids of those days enjoyed, he liked running and playing, he loved playing baseball, he loved going fishing, his early years were marked by many, many days when he was homebound, where he really couldn't even get around or do the normal things that kids would do. Now, my great-grandmother believed very strongly in intellectual development and education, so she would always find little games for him to play. There would be games like she would hide a chocolate bar in a book or behind a book and say, well, you've got to go to this book and read something and come back and tell me about it, and then go look at this one. And when you hit the third one, there would be the chocolate bar. And so she made learning something that was an adventure for him and something that was fun for him, and it developed his mind. This became very important for him later in life. When he was 6 years old, his family decided to move way out to the country. They currently lived downtown. At that point lived in downtown Atlanta, near where St. Luke's Episcopal Church is now. And they decided to move way out in the country for the summertime to a new club that the Atlanta Athletic Club had built called Eastlake. Now, as we all know, Eastlake now is downtown, but it was the end of the trolley line back then. And that was actually very important because remember, in Atlanta, back in those days, most buildings were heated by coal. And so there was a whole bunch of coal dust and pollution that always hung over the city of Atlanta, but it never did at Eastlake. So it was a place where they could go and get some fresh air. And about the same time, one of these just amazing coincidences happened in life, and the Atlanta Athletic Club had hired a Scot named Stuart Maiden to become the golf professional at the Atlanta Athletic Club. He replaced his brother Jimmy, and Stuart was in possession of one of the most unusual golf swings that you would have seen in the United States at the time. In the United States in the early 1900s, the most popular golf swing was a St. Andrews swing, where elbows stayed really tight to the body, and the swing worked around the body that way, with elbows rarely getting away from the body. Harry Vardon was a proponent of that swing, the great Harry Vardon. That's why Vardon used to love to wear suspenders when he played, because it kept those arms just nice and tight and kept everything really connected. Stuart Maiden had something very, very different. Stuart Maiden had a swing that was very syrupy and upright and extremely powerful. And that was the swing that my grandfather learned. Now, if you study much about my grandfather, you'll hear all about how Stuart Maiden taught him how to play golf. Well, the truth of the matter is that's not true in the slightest. There was no formal lesson that my grandfather ever took from Stuart Maiden. Never a formal lesson. He didn't go to a series like we do in a lot of our clubs today. He didn't go to the junior golf series at Eastlake in the summers, because there wasn't one. He learned golf by taking a club and watching Stuart Maiden swing. He learned how to grip the club by seeing how Stuart put his hands on the golf club. He learned how to swing the club back by watching how Stuart did it. And by the time he was 10 years old, it was almost impossible to tell the difference between my grandfather's swing and Stuart Maiden's swing. And that's a remarkable, remarkable thing to say. Stuart Maiden was an outstanding golfer, and that's who my grandfather learned from. Now, 10 years old, he shoots an 80. By the time he's 13, he's the club champion of Druid Hills. There's a picture of him standing with Archer Davidson. Archer Davidson is the man that he defeated for the club championship. And they're standing there together. Archer Davidson is standing here. My grandfather is standing here, and it's about like that to Archer Davidson. And the look on Davidson's face is, shall we say, not one of joy. My grandfather saved the picture, and when he was a little boy, he took the picture, and he took a pen, and he wrote over his name, Champion, and drew an arrow down to him. And over Davidson, he wrote, Runner-up, and drew an arrow down to him. And he saved that for his entire life. Unfortunately, the medal that he got for winning the Druid Hills Club Championship, somehow he lost on the way home. And even though he traced his steps back and forth from the house to Druid Hills time and time again, he never found the medal that he won. That's the only medal that cannot be accounted for in his entire career. So if you ever find a Druid Hills medal from 1915, you may want to just give me a call and let me know. And we will talk, I can assure you. The following year, he played in what was the very first Georgia State Amateur at Capital City Club, Brookhaven. And he won it. Now at that point, the big golfer in Georgia Golf was a young man named Perry Adair. And Perry was going to go to Philadelphia to play in his very first United States Amateurs, Marion Cricket Club in Ardmore. Whitney was just mentioning it. And they had, my grandfather and my great-grandfather talked about it, and they decided it'd be a great thing for Bub to join Perry and just keep him company when he went to Philadelphia. So he went up there, and in the first 2 rounds of qualifying, before they got to the actual U.S. Amateur proper, they played the qualifying rounds on the west course of Marion. The west course in Marion is a lot of fun, but it just doesn't even match up to the east course, which you can probably testify to that. My grandfather shot 73 in the first round of qualifying and led the entire field. He shot a little bit higher in the second round, but qualified very, very comfortably, and went on to the third round of the championship before he was finally defeated by Robert Gardner, who was the U.S. Amateur champion. In his second round match, he played a man named Eben Byers. Now, my grandfather had a miserable temper. I mean, it was volcanic. People used to call him a petulant little boy. That's not true. He had rage. He was a perfectionist and did not tolerate error in the slightest. He was a club thrower, and so was Byers. And they just had the greatest time of all. And in fact, my grandfather beat him 1-up, and he said that the only reason he had beaten Byers at all in that match is because Byers had run out of clubs first. From that time on, until 1923, he became what would now be known as the greatest player in the world to never win a major. Not a real great distinction. And it certainly was something that bothered him. He would get almost all the way up to a semifinal or final in match play, and he would lose inexplicably. He would get into a lead in a stroke play tournament, he would absolutely blow it. And his temper would get the better of him each and every time. And it wasn't until 1923 that he finally broke through and won the United States Open at Inwood Country Club in North Carolina. In 1923, I remember at this point he was 21 years old. Between 1923 and 1930, he went on a stretch of golf that the golf world has not seen from that time until probably Tiger Woods. No one dominated a game in such a concentrated period of time until Tiger. In that time, between 1923 and 1930, he won 13 major championships. He won 4 United States Opens, which no one has ever won more than 4 United States Opens. By the way, he lost 2 of those in the playoff, so it is not out of the realm of possibility that he could have won 6. Give that one a little bit of thought. He won 5 United States Amateurs. He won 3 British Opens, and he won 1 British Amateur. He became the first man in history in 1926 to win what was called the double, when he won the British Open at Royal Lytham in St. Anne's and then went on to win the United States Open at Scioto Country Club in Columbus, Ohio. Interestingly, one of the people in the gallery at Scioto in 1926 was a young man who would eventually become a pharmacist in Columbus. He was a member of Scioto Country Club. This man's name was Charlie Nicholas, and he would later have a son whose name was Jack. And Jack grew up at Scioto Country Club, and his idol was Bob Jones. Parenthetically, my idol is Jack Nicklaus, for many similar reasons. Devotion to family, devotion and love to the game, any one of a number of the reasons, but those are the two biggies. In 1930, he did something that nobody has done before or since. When he won the double in 1926, he started to realize that there was an opportunity in front of him that nobody would have even thought of. And that was, he realized that he could win all 4 of the major championships in a single year. He never told anybody about it except for my grandmother. But he thought that 1930 would set up very, very well for him to do that. And it did. He had played in his British Amateur Championship at St. Andrews and won the Amateur on the old course. He then won the Open at Hoylake in Royal Liverpool. Then came back over here and won the United States Open at Interlaken outside of Minneapolis. And then, my grandfather, I will tell you, you'll see this as you study his life. You will see that my grandfather loved symmetry. He loved things that balance. And so it was very appropriate that he closed out his victory, his last victory in the United States Amateur, at the place where he had began 14 years before, at the Marion Cricket Club in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Whitney has told you he defeated Gene Homans, 8-7. And the interesting thing about that is, on the hole before, the 10th hole at Marion, both he and Homans had taken a 6. So he could have actually beaten him a little bit earlier. And the funny part about that is, if there is an easy hole at Marion, it's number 10. It is, if there's an easy hole, that's it. It's fairly straightforward, fairly nondescript, it's fairly short too. And yet they both double bogeyed it. When my grandfather signed his card, in fact, he took the scorecard, looked where they had both made double bogey, and he circled both 6s and then wrote above it, "Ha ha," and then signed it, Robert T. Jones Jr. So there he was. He had won all 4 majors in the same year. And nobody even knew what to call it back then. The New York Times came up with the great title of Impregnable Quadrilateral, which really drips off the tongue. And the only thing I could have thought would be if you then called it IQ, but I think us psychologists kind of had that already taken by that time. Finally, it was settled on a name, the Grand Slam. Now, to give you an idea how modern golf has gone, we have now gotten to the point where we define Grand Slam as if you just win all 4 majors during your career. He did it all in a single season. The odds of that happening again are next to impossible. The odds of an amateur doing it, even more impossible. So that gives you an idea. Golf Digest in 2000 called it the most pivotal event in the history of golf of the 20th century. I will go even farther, and I'm going to elaborate on this in just a few minutes. I am going to say that Bobby Jones is the most historically significant person in the game of golf ever. Everything in the game of golf is defined by what it was like up to Bobby Jones and how it is after Bobby Jones. Even today, that holds true. So when you become a part of Bobby Jones Links, you are stepping into a legacy that has its roots in a very particular man and at a very particular time and place. After he won the Grand Slam, he did what nobody thought he would ever do. He retired from competitive golf. But he didn't quit golf. He designed a little golf course about 120 miles from here, west and east of here, called Augusta National Golf Club, and he started a tournament called the Masters Tournament. he decided he wanted to write books about the game of golf. And the book Bobby Jones on Golf is still considered to be a standard for people who want to know more about the game of golf. It's still an incredibly well-written book. He wrote something slightly more autobiographical later called Golf is My Game. If you don't have it, it's a great book. You would enjoy it. And we don't really make much royalty on it, so I'm not making a picture. Now, he also made a series of instructional videos that are still considered to be state-of-the-art, and those are done in 1931 and 1932. His life was absolutely what anyone would have ever dreamed of. He had a beautiful home in Buckhead. He was playing golf with his friends. He had a wife who he adored. He had 3 beautiful children. He always felt that his life was just where he wanted it. It would be playing golf, developing some different ideas that he had for the game, practicing law, and that was how it was going to look. He had a house in Highlands, North Carolina, where he would travel periodically. And he thought that was what it would be from then on. Until, all of a sudden, life came back to get his attention. You see, back in 1929, he'd been playing around the golf with his father and a couple of friends at East Lake. And they were on what was then the 12th hole. It's now number 3. And he was getting ready to hit his shot. One of those freak thunderstorms kind of came out of nowhere like we had here in Atlanta. And the bolt of lightning hit in the middle of the 10th fairway, maybe 300 yards from where they were standing. The 4 men took off like a shot and ran back towards the clubhouse. And just when they got to the clubhouse, a bolt of lightning hit the chimney and it exploded. And a big piece of the chimney came down and tore through my grandfather's umbrella, struck him a glancing blow to the neck, tore his shirt off, and knocked him to the ground. He thought, after he woke up, a couple of minutes later, he thought, oh, boy, am I glad I dodged a bullet on that one. But he didn't. It was just a bullet that would travel very, very slowly. In 1930, he started noticing some funny things. When he was over in St. Andrews, for example, to play in the British Amateur, he noticed he had a little bit of a crick in his neck, which he just described as sleeping with the window open. By the time World War II came, he would notice occasionally that the very, very tips of his fingers would have a tingle to them, and he couldn't feel on the very, very top of the fingers. Now that, folks, is not normal. Normally, like most of us, if we have nerve issues, we're going to feel it right there, not on the very top. That's called a rank neurological sign. But he didn't know that. He didn't know that. He came back from the war and he continued playing golf with his friends. But eventually, by about 1946, 1947, he started noticing that his right foot would start to turn under occasionally when he walked. And eventually, the pain in his neck started becoming very severe. And at one point, he was out with some friends in East Lake in 1947 or 48. And he said to them, guys, he said, I've really enjoyed playing golf with you, but I'm not going to be able to play for a little while now. I've got to go into Emory and get some surgery done on my neck to find out why I'm having this pain. So he went and had the surgery, and nothing got better. He went to doctor after doctor after doctor. And finally, he went to Houston Merritt, who was the chief of neurology at Columbia University in New York. And Dr. Merritt, who wrote Merritt's textbook on neurology, to this day, that is the standard textbook in neurology. Dr. Merritt came to him and he said, Bob, he said, I have some news for you, and it's not good. My grandfather said, well, what is it? He said, this condition you have in your neck is called syringomyelia. Syringomyelia. He said, it is where a fluid-filled cyst forms in your central nervous cord, and there's nothing we can really do. And my grandfather said, well, what is the prognosis? He said, it is going to continue to grow, and it will paralyze everything below where it is located. And all of a sudden, this man who the world had called the Emperor Jones, who had stood on top of the world, as many cartoons would show him back in the 1920s, found out that he was going to lose everything from the neck down. Later that year, he was riding along on a golf cart with Al Lane, who was a writer for the International Herald Tribune newspaper. And Al said, "Bob, I hear you've had some problems." He said, "Tell me, what is it? What's the prognosis?" And my grandfather said, "Well, Al," he said, "I'm going to tell you now, the prognosis is not good. It's not going to get better, and it's only going to get worse." He said, "In the end, it's going to kill me." But he said, "Al, in golf, we play the ball where it lies. And now we'll never talk about this again." And they never did. Playing the ball where it lies is such an important part of who Bobby Jones was. You know, for a lot of people, it's very easy to fall prey to the bad breaks. It's one thing to have bad breaks. We all have them. Whether it's in business, whether it's in life, whether it's in sports, whether it's in our health, bad breaks are going to come. But the question is, how do you handle them? And that's another area where Bobby Jones really excelled. I want to pause our story and I want to talk to you a little bit about something that happened a number of years behind this. Back in 1925, he was playing in the United States Open at Worcester Country Club in Massachusetts. His playing partner was his very dear friend, Gene Sarazen. They came to the 11th hole. It was a long par 4, and my grandfather hit an approach shot that kind of bounced onto the green and kicked off to the back left of the green, leaving him a very, very ticklish chip out of thick rough to a green that was sloping away from him. He analyzed the shot. He used to always have a little cigarette in his mouth. He threw his cigarette down, grabbed his club, set up over the ball, looked at the hole, and when he looked down at the ball had rolled over. He couldn't believe it. Just couldn't believe it. He called over an official, and he said, "My ball has moved." And the official looked at him because this is Bobby Jones. The official looked at him and said, "Well, now, Bob, are you sure it moved and didn't just oscillate?" And my grandfather said, "No, it moved. It rolled over. It was here. It's now here." They assessed him a one-shot penalty for violating Rule 18 of the rules of golf, causing the ball to move. By the time the tournament ended, that one shot became very critical as he found himself in a tie with Willie McFarland and ended up losing an 18-hole playoff the next day by one shot. And when somebody praised him for that, and said, "Wow, what a fantastic thing. You called a penalty on yourself in the United States Open. You could have been the winner of this thing." He just looked at him and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. You may as well praise a man for not robbing a bank. That's just how you play the game. You play the ball as it lies, no matter where you are." And so he did. Growing up, well, let me tell you this. My grandfather was a very loving man. He was a very loving and caring man. And yet in my entire life, I never knew what it was like for my grandfather even to hug me, because he couldn't move his arms enough. I never knew what it was like to do the typical grandfather-grandson things with him. We never played golf together. We never went fishing together. We didn't go to sporting events together. But we would sit for hours at a time in his little sleeping porch just off of his bedroom, just the two of us, watching TV, talking about just inane things, because I was a little kid. And yet, he had that ability to look at me right smack in the eye and to make me realize that I was the most important person in the world to him. And that was a gift he had with everybody, because he recognized the value of everybody. I'll tell you a story. He used to keep a letter at his desk, and after he died, this was found. It was a letter from a man who was the caddy master at the Country Club in Brookline, one of the finest and premier golf clubs in the United States. And it was a letter that he had kept where the caddy master was writing to thank him for sending a letter of recommendation so that his son could gain admission to Harvard Law School. Now let me ask you a question. How many great and famous people in the world would really take the time to get to know somebody that was in a servant position to him? Much less take the time to help their child's career. But Buck did. When I worked at the C&S Bank on the old Marietta Broad Street in downtown Atlanta, I remember one time I was standing waiting for my ride, and an old gentleman came out from the bank, and he said to me, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Jones?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, I just wanted to tell you," he said, "my name's Mary, and I work in the mailroom." I said, "Oh, I know who you are." And yes. He said, "Well, I wanted to tell you, I remember when I was a young man just starting to work at the bank, I remember your grandfather would drive up in his Cadillac every morning, and his chauffeur would pick him up, literally pick him up, put him in his wheelchair, and bring him in the bank." And he said, "Every morning, Mr. Jones, your grandfather would stop and talk to me and ask me how I was doing." And he said, "You know, he didn't have to do that." Because you know, there's something about relationships. My grandfather once, we were talking, I wanted to ask him about some of the famous people he had met, like President Eisenhower and Winston Churchill, and all the great golfers. And my grandfather said, "Oh, I'll talk to you about that." And he said, "There's something you need to know first, son, and you need to never forget this." "What is it, Bob?" He said, "You need to never forget," actually his hand was like this, he said, "you need to never forget that sometimes little people in this world are really the biggest. Big people in this world are really, really small." He said, "So don't ever judge them by where they're standing. It's who they are that's important." That's Bob Jones. You know, it's very funny. For a man of such accomplishment, 2 degrees, one from Georgia Tech, one from Emory University. You know, he attended Harvard, one from Harvard, he had Harvard College, And he went to Emory University, and after a year and a half, he took the bar exam on a dare and passed it. So he became probably the most well-known dropout of Emory Law School. He started a law firm that is now known as Alston & Bird, which is one of the largest law firms in the United States. For all of that, the things that were the most important to him were the people in his life. I'll tell you another story to highlight that. One year, a number of years back, I was at Augusta for the Masters. And I had to go to a meeting, so I was wearing a tie, which I love that. But that's what I was doing. And I was walking up the 10th fairway with my wife, and all of a sudden, this man came up to me. He was very old at the time, and he was wearing one of these bucket hats that had every Masters badge that he had ever been to on. You don't see those much anymore, because as the event has become more corporate, you see less and less of the people that have been there for like 30 and 40 years. But this man was there. And we were standing by the 10th fairway, and all of a sudden he looked at my badge. He stopped. He said, "Excuse me, sir." He said, "I see your name is Bob Jones." "Yes." He said, "Are you related to Bobby Jones?" "Yeah, I'm his grandson." He said, "Oh, let me tell you, he said, I've been coming to this tournament for a long time." And I was looking at his hat, and I was like, "Yeah, I can see that." He said, "I want to tell you, years ago, I remember when your father would get your grandfather and put him in a golf cart and strap him in, and they would ride around the golf course together. And I remember so many times when your grandfather would just stop right by me, and we would just talk. And he said, your grandfather was just, and your dad too, they were just the nicest, most approachable people in the world." He said, "You know, and I was a nobody." And he said that phrase came up again. He said, "And you know, he didn't have to do that." But he did, because it was the relationships that were important. Here's the thing. If there are 3 things my grandfather was noted for, it was innovation, We now know that design at Augusta National that we now think of as the most traditional statement of American golf, at the time it was built, it was radical. There was no golf course built like that in the United States. There were virtually no trees on it. There was very, very little bunkering. And yet, it challenged the expert and was accessible to the duffer. When he put out his series of instructional videos, he used technology that we would not see again for 50 more years in doing videos in the 1930s. When he wrote about golf instruction, he wrote with such precision and such detail that it is still now, his writing still to this day is considered the model of how to play the game of golf. So innovation was a very, very important thing to him. A love for the average guy and the average lady and the average golfer, that too was a big deal. When he started designing clubs for Spalding, let me tell you about what he did. One of the things he realized was that the game of golf is just stinking hard. I don't know if any of you know that, but it is a hard game. And he realized that one of the things that these people had to do, that golfers had to do, is they had to fight against their equipment. So how do we get equipment designed to make the game more fun to the average guy? The first thought he came up with was, wouldn't it be great if we could just make all irons the same length? That would just be ideal, because then you only have to learn one swing. Unfortunately, he found out as an engineer that the way metallurgy was in those days, you couldn't get the weighting right. So he did the next best thing. When he designed the Robert T. Jones Jr. Pro Flights for Spalding, he designed them to where, while he couldn't get everything the same length, he could at least make fewer lengths to have to contend with. So the 1 and 2 iron were the same length, the 3 and 4 iron were the same length, the 5 and 6, the 7 and 8, and the 9 and wedge. So that the average player at least didn't have to fight 10 different swings. He also became the first person to manufacture a set of clubs that had what was called a swing weight that could be matched, so that the 9 iron felt like the 2 iron, making it a lot easier to hit. So, and this is another area where he was very innovative. He also broke with tradition and designed clubs with a brand new material in the shaft called steel. Everything else had been hickory. And when they came out with the steel shafts, just to tell you this, they couldn't sell them. Nobody wanted to buy a steel shafted club, even with Bobby Jones's name on it, and the reason they didn't is because Bobby Jones played with hickory. And he said, oh, okay. So he got the clubs back. They found a way to make the shafts just a little bit thinner, and they painted them all yellow to look like hickory, and then they became the leading selling golf club in the United States for like 30 years. So Bobby Jones was known for innovation. In terms of excellence, he is unbridled. He graduated with honors from Georgia Tech. He then went to Harvard, where he studied classics and English literature and earned his second bachelor's degree from Harvard, again with honors. When he went to Harvard, interestingly enough, he had already used his eligibility to play golf while at Tech, so he went to the golf coach at Harvard. And he said, Coach, I would love to be able to help you with your golf team, but I've used my eligibility, and I'm wondering if I can volunteer to be the manager of your golf team. And the coach said, well, Bob, we've already got a manager, but I'm sure he'd be glad to step aside for you. And my grandfather said, no, don't worry about that. You have an assistant manager. I said, well, no, we don't. Well, I'll be the assistant manager of golf team. What are my jobs? What's my task? He said, your job's real simple. Keep the clubs and shoes clean and guard the whiskey on road trips. Bob always said he was much better at the last one than he was at the first one. And that's what he did in his time at Harvard. He also periodically would play the entire Harvard golf team. They would go out and play, and he would play their best ball. Their best ball. And Harvard had a pretty good team back then, and they never beat it with their best ball. Think about that for a while. Excellence was, as a lawyer, was a big thing for him. He loved working with young lawyers, and he loved to teach them how to craft briefs that were concise and to the point. And as we've said, his law firm is now one of the finest law firms in the country. But again, it comes down to relationships, the hallmark of what made Bobby Jones who he was. As he went through his adult life and as his disease progressed, there would be times when he would meet people and they would come away after talking to him, and it was only after they had talked to him, gone away, that they realized, holy cow, I just talked to a man that hasn't been out of a chair in 10 years. And he had no self-pity, no, oh poor me, any of that. He was just that positive and that focused on other people. His disease finally progressed. And by 1970, this man who had basically dominated the world was down to about 80 pounds. And by December of 1971, it was very obvious that the end was in sight. This is a man that for many, many years he had the devotion of his family, but never really grown hugely close to them. And in that last year, his relationship so deepened with his children and with his wife. He had been devoted to him by his side since they were married in 1924. 3 days before he died, he called to the Cathedral of Christ the King in downtown Atlanta and asked if Monsignor Stapleton could come over and visit with him for a while. And while there, he was baptized, received his first communion, and received his last reverence. The day later, surrounded by his wife and children, this man who had accomplished so much with his life turned to them and he said, you know, this is what it's like to die. It's beautiful. Later that day, he closed his eyes for the last time. On Saturday, December the 18th, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in the town of St. Andrews, Scotland, the flag of Scotland flies on a flagpole to the coastal side of the clubhouse of the R&A. This same city where my grandfather had been named a Freeman of the City in 1958, only the second American ever to receive that honor, the first being Benjamin Franklin. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that flag came down to half-staff. Everybody on the golf course, all 6 of the golf courses, saw it, and they all came in because they all knew that Bobby Jones was gone. And yet, to this day, his legacy lives on. It lives on through our family. It lives on through my sisters, me, my cousins, their children, our children. It lives on through programs like the Bobby Jones Chiari Ringo Mailia Foundation. It lives on through the Robert T. Jones Jr. program at Emory. It lives on through our commercial partners at Jones Global Sports, at Piedmont Distillers in North Carolina, and now it lives on through you. When my grandfather would be asked when he was in his playing days, Bob, what are you going to do when you retire? He would turn to O.B. Keeler, the writer of the Atlanta Journal, who would always accompany him to all his tournaments. And he'd look at O.B. and he'd say, you tell him, O.B. And O.B. would grab a glass of whiskey, which never seemed to be too far from O.B.'s hand. And he would say a poem. He would say, if I ever become a rich man, or if ever I grow to be old, I will build myself a strong thatch house to shelter me from the cold. I will hold my house in the high wood, within a walk of the sea. Men who were boys when I was a boy will sit and drink with me. Friendship and friends, as he said in 1958, are a man's greatest treasure. A life filled with friendship is rich indeed. Thank you, friends of Bobby Jones, and welcome to the Bobby Jones family.
Tell us about your father.
My dad?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah, my dad, my father died when I was very young. He was 47 years old when he died of a heart attack. 2 years almost to the day after Bub died. My dad died on December 20th, 1973. My dad was, to me, my father, he really was the most dominant man in my life. And to this day, I mean, if I ever really, when the day comes that I come to the end of my life, that's the person I hope to be measured to, is my own father. Dad was an outstanding golfer. Dad, just like my grandfather, was a veteran of World War II. Unlike my grandfather, who was discharged as a lieutenant colonel, my father kept getting his way up to corporal and then going out, having a little party, and going back down to private. Going back down to private. Dad, when he came back, took over my grandfather's Coca-Cola businesses in Massachusetts and Vermont, and they became absolutely best friends. They, in fact, there was a private phone line that ran between Atlanta and our home in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And the only people that had the other number was my grandfather and my father. We were always told, if you wish to live, never answer the green phone. And never use the green phone. Never use the green phone. Dad was an outstanding golfer. He had a +3 handicap at his peak and played at 3 national amateurs. If you go to the Country Club of Pittsfield in Massachusetts to this day, and you look from the years about 1952 all the way to about 1970, my father was club champion there about, 12 times, and runner-up about another 5 times. And, he was just very dominant. Dad was a vice president at Augusta National, member of the museum committee for the United States Golf Association. It really isn't a stretch to think that had my father lived, that he might well have been able to hold a real trifecta of his own. It's not out of the realm of possibility that he would have been captain of the R&A, chairman of Augusta National, and president of the USGA. He was gone way too soon. And it's sort of sad in some ways. You have to hear this all from me. It would have been better to hear it from him. But in fact, just last week would have been his 92nd birthday. So, yeah.
Greatest generation.
Yeah, he was a great guy. He was great. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any sons?
Yes, I will. I do. I lost my son 7 years ago. His name was Michael, and he too was a really great guy. He was adopted, lived up in Cleveland. He was a salesman. In fact, he worked for a company that did barcodes. Mike had a sense of humor. I have no idea where he got that from. He used to like to say to people, well, so what do you do? So I work for Barcode ID Systems. Well, what is that? Michael would go, well, you know in the Bible where it talks about that mark of the beast thing? Yeah. Mike would say, well, I sell them. we lost Mike in March 7 years ago. I do have a daughter who lives in Memphis, and she is a master cosmetology instructor and teaches at the Paul Mitchell School in Memphis. And unfortunately, the only bad thing I can say about her is that she lives in Memphis, which is 6.5 hours away. I wish it was a little closer.
Do you work with athletes now, or what does your practice entail now?
I do work a lot with athletes. I don't at the moment work with any pros. I work a lot with amateurs. Strangely, I get a lot of business from businessmen who really need to get their game kind of in shape for their work. So I do a lot with them. And I work with a lot of junior golfers. I have a couple of juniors that I'm working with now who are nationally and internationally ranked. And you know, a lot of what I do with them is really interesting because the demands that are placed on junior golfers now are really, really extreme. And a lot of dealing with them psychologically isn't so much on helping them maintain their focus in terms of how they play in tournaments. It's helping them maintain their focus in all the other demands that are placed on their lives. So I do. And I've worked also with tennis players. The strangest one I've ever done is I did work once with a professional bull rider. That was interesting. That was very interesting. Well, he came to me, I said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, I need 0.2 of a second longer on the bull. And I was kind of like, why do you even want to get on the bull? But then the bull rider. So yes, we got him 0.3 of a second. All right. So that was really good. That's fine. Yes,
Okay. So your grandfather designed Augusta and Peachtree, that's correct?
Correct?
So I live up in Canton. What is his connection to the little 9-holer just outside my
Yes.
house?
He played it quite a bit, and they will tell you that he had a hand in the design, sort of. He basically made a couple of suggestions here and there, but I mean, he was obviously connected with it because it's kind of hard to see anything in Canton that doesn't have Jones on it somewhere.
Right.
The other one, there's another one out in Covington. I can't remember the name of it, but
The
they
Oaks.
claim, pardon?
The Oaks.
The Oaks, yeah. They claim that he designed the golf course. Yeah, probably not. But considering I worked in Conyers and Covington for like 15 years, and I'm not going to stop him from saying that because I mean, it's one of those stories that if it isn't true, it should be.
Yes. I've read a lot about your family over the years. You never know what's true and what's not, but I'm curious. I read that your father made it up into the quarterfinals of the U.S. Amateur in 1959 and pulled Jack Nicklaus.
No. That's close.
Okay.
What Kevin was asking is, he heard that my father made it to the quarterfinals in 1959 when we're losing to Jack Nicklaus. Well, that's not exactly true. Let me tell you, I'll tell you the truth. Here it is. Back in the 1950s, if you wanted to get in the Masters, you had to make it to at least the quarterfinals of the United States Amateur. And so my father had been working on his game, just slavishly working on his game all that year, and had gotten his handicap down to like +3. He was just killing it. And he was talking to my grandfather, and my grandfather said, well, son, I'm really excited. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly out to Colorado and see you play. Now you got to understand, flying for my grandfather was a very painful experience because nowadays we don't realize it because we fly in jets nowadays. Jets don't vibrate. Propeller planes will shake you up, and if you've got a neurological condition, that will really hurt. So for my grandfather to say, I'm going to fly out and watch you play in the amateur, that was a big deal. And my grandfather and my dad were talking about it, and they said, I just can't, Bub said, I just can't see what could go wrong. I think you can make the quarters this year. He said, the only thing I can think of would be if something crazy happened, like you drew Jack Nicklaus in the first round, but I mean, what are the odds? Well, let me tell you what the odds are. If you actually do draw Jack Nicklaus in the first round, those odds are 1-to-1. And that's exactly what happened to my father. So the pairings got published. They called up my grandfather, told him the pairings. My father called and said, Dad, you still going to fly out to see me play? My grandfather said, son, I think that's an awful lot for me to endure just to watch you play 12 holes. And Jack got on the first tee with my father. Jack was like 19 years old at this point. My father shakes his hand and said, Jack, my dad was going to be here today, but he just didn't see much point in me coming out to see me play 12 holes. And anyway, he said, I asked him about the match. My dad told me, he said, I really thought, even though I was being nice, I really thought I had a chance to take this. I thought I could beat it. Because as I stood on the first tee of the Broadmoor, I hit my driver out there about 255 with a little fade. He said, Jack stood up on the tee with a 3-wood and hit this bomb that when it went over my ball, it was still going up. That's when I knew I was in trouble. And Jack closed him out 7-6 on the 12th hole.
I like your version of the story.
If it had been the quarters, he would have gotten the Masters. Anybody else? Yes, sir. What's your name?
I'm Drew.
Hi, Drew.
The Jones family is something that I've heard about my entire life. I actually grew up in Augusta, Georgia. Spent 22 years there, and played a lot of the courses in the area. Augusta Country Club, Forest Hills. I know all those places are places that Bobby Jones played. My question is what was the Jones family's connection to Augusta? Why was Augusta the place that he decided to build the Augusta National? Was there any prior family experiences or ties to the Augusta area?
My grandfather played a lot of golf in the Augusta area over his life. He had always wanted to build a golf course when he retired from competitive play, and even by 1927, he knew that Alistair McKenzie was the person he wanted to work with about it, but he didn't really know where he wanted it to be. He liked the Augusta area because Augusta's climate is much more gentle than Atlanta's. Atlanta sits 1,000 feet above sea level, and as we know, we can get some very, very intemperate weather throughout the winter. Augusta sits slightly below sea level, and its climate is much more amenable to winter golf. Also, back in those days, my grandfather knew that in order to build a club, it would have to be a national club. And so the main rail line that ran from New York down to Florida would stop in Augusta. And in fact, for many, many years, a lot of the New York businessmen that would travel south in the winter would take a week or two, and they would spend a week or two at Palmetto Golf Club in Aiken, which is a hidden gem, or at Aiken Country Club, or Augusta Country Club, or Forest Hills. So the Augusta area was just ripe for something for my grandfather. He was, at one point, a man, Tom Barrett, who would later go on to be mayor of Augusta, who had introduced my grandfather to Cliff Roberts, brought the two of them out to the old Fruitlands nursery. And my grandfather, when he stood out now where the big oak trees are at Augusta National, my grandfather stood out in the land, he looked over that and he said, I have never seen anything that looks like a golf course was just waiting to be put down on it. He said, in fact, in my mind's eye, it looks like it's already there. So it was really a very practical decision based on where could he get the membership, where could he find the right land, and how could that all come together. There were a number of people in Atlanta, though, that had very, very hard feelings about him building his course in Augusta. And that's why just about 15 years later, he built Peachtree. And it was a very similar philosophy. And if you actually play both courses, you can see that they really are cousins of each other. Although I think, and I'll get in trouble saying this, I think Peachtree is the more mature of the two, because when my grandfather built it, he was 15 years older, and his thoughts on what a golf course should be had developed somewhat. And also, Augusta has had to be modified over the years to accommodate today's tournament golf conditions. You know, it used to be that as I said, that the average guy could go out and play Augusta National and have a great time, and the tournament player could be really challenged. Because of the demands that tournament players place on a golf course nowadays, Augusta has to be kept in pretty close to tournament shape pretty much all year round. And I guarantee you, your average player is going to have a very frustrating day on those greens, just because they have to be that way. Peachtree still has a little bit of that old too. Does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
And what did it cost to build Augusta?
Oh gosh, I don't remember, but I think it was like $100,000 and some odd or something. And that was paying a living wage. Bub would not pay, now, but bear in mind, they used to, the working hours of building Augusta National is, they said they worked from can to can. From when you can see to when you can't. And what we now see as Amen Corner had to be dredged out. That is the lowest part of the golf course, and it still gets very wet, as Jordan Spieth found out a few years ago. And in fact, when he dropped that ball, I knew what was going to happen, because it's the wettest spot on the golf course. You could not have rain for 3 months and stand where he was standing, and it's wet. So at any rate, but yeah, they had to dredge it out by horse cart. When people tell me, oh, Amen Corner, it's so naturally beautiful. Oh, it's just so natural. You wouldn't believe what it takes to keep that place looking as natural as it is. It takes a lot of work. We got some golf course superintendents in here. How easy is it to make something look natural? Not easy at all. So, yeah. Anyone else?
The only thing I was going to add is maybe speak to how your grandfather would feel about, because he was such an innovator. A lot of us that are maybe non-golfers just know him as this great golf guy. I think one of the things that he was so good about is making golf almost got very more inclusive. So things that inclusive,
yes.
So that young people, disabled people, women, things like that were a little more equal. And I think for a lot of the younger crowd now, bringing that back, that he would be maybe speak to that a little bit.
Tell me your name.
I'm Lisa.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah, it's okay.
All right, Lisa. Well, since we're all part of the Bobby Jones family, can I speak to this very freely?
Please.
Yes. There's been a lot of garbage that's been written about about my grandfather over the last few years, and quite frankly, it really infuriates the daylights out of me. You will hear people talk about how my grandfather was a racist. You will hear how my grandfather did not like women. You will see that periodically pop up in the press. Now, anytime that pops up, it's very quickly shot down, but it is a problem because it bears no truth to it at all. My grandfather was probably one of the most egalitarian people you would ever meet. By that I mean, he was a golfer, okay? Golfers don't care what your gender is, your sex is, your race is. Golfers care about one thing. What is that? What did you shoot? Right? In the 1950s, Charlie Sifford won a championship won a tournament on the PGA Tour and somehow did not get an invitation to the Masters because Cliff Roberts, who was the tournament chairman, refused to extend one. My grandfather was infuriated by that. The next year, he had instructed the club that they needed to come up with set criteria by which, if you did one of those things, you would receive an invitation to the Masters, period. And he wrote Charlie Sifford a letter that is still extant to this day, in which he told Charlie how sorry he was that he did not qualify for the Masters that year, but that he certainly hoped that with these new credentials and qualifying credentials in place, that he would qualify in the future. Sifford saved that letter, and it periodically shows up. At the Atlanta Athletic Club in the 1950s, Charles Harrison was a fantastic regional player. He came to qualify for the U.S. Open and was told he was playing golf with a man named George Johnson. Well, George Johnson came up from Warner Robins, where he was serving in the military, and George Johnson just happened to be an African-American man. When he got to Eastlake, George Brett, who was the caddy master, who's a really nice guy, George Brett saw him coming up. He said, "Oh yeah, the caddy barn's down that way." And George Johnson said, "No, I'm here to play. I'm trying to qualify for the Open." They went out and they played 18 holes, and as was customary at the time, they finished the first 18. Charles said, "George, there's a buffet for the players in the clubhouse, and you're welcome to come on in and have lunch." Well, so Charles and George walk into the clubhouse, and it's like an old E.F. Hutton moment, if you remember those ads. It's like all of a sudden, everything just stops in the clubhouse. And Charles takes George through the lunch line. They have lunch. And after the lunch, they go out and play that afternoon. And 2 days later, Charles gets a letter from the board at the Atlanta Athletic Club stating that his actions in inviting an African-American golfer into the clubhouse were against the rules and spirit of the club, and that the board would have to determine whether or not his membership would be pulled. Charles wrote back immediately and he said, "I stand firmly behind what I did. The man was a contestant for qualifying in the United States Open." And he said, "And I feel certain that Bob Jones would agree with me." So they contacted my grandfather, and my grandfather wrote a letter and said that the only criteria by which people should be allowed in or not into a tournament is by their ability as an athlete. Anything else is irrelevant. So I offer that. In terms of inclusivity, one of the very first people that was frequently invited to Augusta National was a lady named Marion Hollins, who was an outstanding female amateur champion in the 1920s. She played the first round at Pasatiempo in California with my grandfather in 1929. They were extremely close friends. The only reason Augusta did not have women members at the time was, who would have thought of it? Who would have even thought of it? And by the way, I say that about the athletic club. I'm a very proud member of the athletic club, and I will also tell you that we don't publicize it, but we know for a fact that of all the major clubs in Atlanta, Of all the historic clubs in Atlanta, the Atlanta Athletic Club was the very first club to remove race, gender, religion from its application. And and that was done back in the 1970s. So, and I think that reflects where my grandfather was. Now, was he, does that mean that he was like some progressive icon? No. But he was, I mean, his whole thing was come down to this, what you shoot. And as for the rest of it, all same.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I meant everything like that handicap thing with the golf carts, I didn't know, I mean, handicap.
He probably wouldn't have thought about it. He probably wouldn't have thought about it. Yes, he would.
Yeah,
the only reason he would not have thought about it before is the technology just didn't even exist back then.
I think he would love that, that was my point. He would love
yeah.
that there's an opportunity for a club like this, a company, to bring those things into
Look,
play.
yes, what Bobby Jones Links has the opportunity to do is bring some technology to the game that not only is going to appeal, it's going to appeal to about the broadest possible group that you can possibly find. And that's him. That's him. And it's going to do it in a very egalitarian manner, which I think is even better. I've got that. Yes, sir. Tell me your name.
My name is Brad.
Hey, Brad.
Just real quick, behind many great men, there's the other half. There's a great woman, there's the Rocket family. It's a little bit more about the grandmother.
Grandmother?
Yeah, how she...
My grandmother, her name was Mary Rice Malone. Her maiden name was Mary Rice Malone. We called her Nina. Nina she was absolutely one of the finest ladies in the truest sense of the word you could ever meet. When in 1930, she was having dinner, late 1930s, she was having dinner with, at the time, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And she was having horrible morning sickness at the time. And she managed to eat all the courses of her dinner. Now, she then went off later and totally sick all over the place. But she always believed in, everything was always done properly. She was fiercely loyal to my grandfather. They were childhood sweethearts. They had neither of them ever dated anybody else. Once I asked her, well, did you ever date other people? She said, I never even kissed another man until I kissed your grandfather, and after that, I never saw the need to kiss another. But she was tough as nails. One time we were driving down from Massachusetts, and the air conditioner of our car went out somewhere in South Carolina. Now this is this is like in late June. So Dad used to drive in a coat and tie. And so when the air conditioning out, Dad took off his coat, later he took off his tie, and he's just got this sweat just going down his dress shirt. And he pulls up in front of the house in Atlanta, and he gets there, and Nina comes out of the house like a bullet, sees him in his open collared shirt, and she goes, young man, what do you mean driving half naked? Dad was like, sorry, Mom. I was about a 3-year-old boy. We would have these formal dinners at night in the dining room. And as a 3 or 4-year-old boy, I was not the most, well-mannered of children. And I was really acting up at the table. And my father corrected me. My grandmother gently put her knife and fork down, looked over at my father, and said, we don't tolerate that kind of behavior at the table. You go upstairs right now. To my father! She was tough. She was really tough. And yet, she could be very, very gentle. I'll tell you about her devotion. In 1968, they had a housekeeper in the house they lived in on Tuxedo Road, and the television blew up in the housekeeper's room, and the house caught on fire. And smoke started to fill the upstairs of Whitehall, the house where they lived. My father happened to be there, and he came and he scooped up my grandfather and carried him outside away from the smoke, and my grandmother came with him. And they just stood there, and my dad just held my grandfather until the fire department had everything put out and brought him back inside and got him settled. And when he came home, I said to my dad, I said, I'm glad everything's okay, Dad. He said, well, me too. He said, the thing is, he said, if I hadn't been there, he said, I I said, yeah, and I interrupted like I always did. I said, well, yeah, Bob would have died. He said, no, not just that. He said both of them would have, because Nina was not going to leave Bob's side. So she was very, very remarkable, very fiercely devoted lady, especially to her family. So, very beautiful.